introduction and for inviting me to speak to you tonight. The last time I did a lecture, as you mentioned, was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we were confined to our homes and armchair travel really was the only means of escape. It's therefore a very great relief to be back here and able to tell you about places you can go right now. International tourism is back, and with it, an opportunity for all of us to get on the road, exploring, meeting new people, and learning new things. Tonight, I will be talking about Uzbekistan, the Silk Roads, and some of the very special places you can visit in April and May on Travel the Unknown's Silk Road Secrets of Uzbekistan tour. Raoul and I created this itinerary together, and it's the only tour I'm leading to Uzbekistan this year, so I'm very excited about it. Have the next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. I'm going to start my talk, though, with some historical and geographical scene setting. The Silk Road is a phrase we often hear, but it's a misnomer. There was not just one road, but rather an extensive network of interconnected, intercontinental trading routes. And silk was far from the only, or even the most important, good being traded. In fact, although the history of these silk roads is millennia long, it is only since the 19th century that this name has been used to describe it. The man who popularized it was a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, who used the term Seidenstrasse, the German for Silk Road, in the title of his book, Über die zentralasiatischen Seidenstrasse Bindung, and he published this in 1877. Where did the Silk Roads go? Well, you have to think of it like a spider's web, stretching between Europe and Asia. In the West, cities such as Venice and Istanbul could reasonably claim to be the Western termini, though goods traded along the Silk Road certainly didn't stop there. As we look east along the map, cities such as Aleppo, Damascus, and Baghdad had key roles to play as regional centers of trade, culture, and political power. My own fascination, though, is with the historic sites of what of the now 5 Central Asian republics, in particular Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. You can find Silk Road cities in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, north into Russia, and then, of course, east to China as well, where you can still visit the likes of Xi'an, Kashgar, and Dunhuang. My interest, though, as I say, is that very central part in Central Asia. Next slide, please. The Silk Road Secrets of Uzbekistan itinerary focuses on the very heart of the Silk Roads. Since 1991, these lands have fallen within what is now the Republic of Uzbekistan. But in its 1,000 years of human history, they've been an integral part of numerous empires, including those of Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Amir Timur, more about him later, and for much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. Together, these changing borders, combined with the ribbons of long-distance trading routes widening their way within them, account for the incredibly rich, complex cultural heritage, which is clearly evident when you visit the country today. Next slide, please. We know from paleontological and archaeological finds that this area has been inhabited for at least 70,000 years. The most archaic remains, the Neanderthal skeleton of a child who died at around 10 years old, were discovered in the Teshiktash cave in southern Uzbekistan in 1938. The placement of ibex horns in the same pit grave suggests the child may have been ritually buried, although we don't know for sure. Ibex were certainly common in prehistoric times, and the landscape would have been much more fertile and rich in wildlife than it is today. These were good hunting grounds, including in areas which are now desert. We know this not only because of the fossil and bone discoveries, but also because of a huge number of petroglyphs. There are more than 150 of these rock art sites across Uzbekistan, concentrated in the Fergana Valley, Tashkent Oasis, and in the Navoy region, which is where we will see them on the tour. The oldest petroglyphs here date from the Mesolithic era, and they depict a wide range of species, including elephants, which have long since died out in the wild. Part of their decline is due to climate change, but the number of archers also shown in the artworks, as you can see in the top right hand of this particular picture, also make it likely that other, tastier species were hunted to extinction. Next slide, please. These earliest inhabitants would have been hunter-gatherers, moving wherever they thought there would be food. Nomads raising and herding livestock came later, and settled populations later still. The earliest built settlement we will see, and which survives, is Kampir Tepe near to Temiz in Secundaria in the southern part of Uzbekistan. Archaeologist Edvard Freladze and his colleagues recently identified this site as Alexandria on the Oxus, one of the lost cities of Alexander the Great. The reason the identification of this site took so long is that the name implies that the city was on the river Oxus, now known as the Amudarya, but the site they were excavating was quite some distance from the riverbank. And in fact, if you look at this picture on the far horizon beyond the strip of green, that's where the river lies. When they discovered the city's port, however, at Kampir Tepe, they realized that the river must have changed its course in the 2,300 years since Kampir Tepe was built. The lack of a reliable water supply nearby is probably why the site was abandoned. The Amudarya, the river, is the lifeblood of Central Asia, irrigating crops and providing drinking water in places where there is hardly any rainfall. Today, long lengths of the river form the international border, first between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and then between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. For this reason, it's no longer navigable, but in antiquity, it was a critical transport artery for goods and for people, a wet section of the Silk Roads. Old Termiz has a substantial port, bazaars and caravanserais, and was a wealthy regional centre. Next slide, please. One of the most fascinating things to have travelled along the Silk Road, or specifically along the river to Termiz, is Buddhism, because the Amudarya, the river, was a conduit for ideas as well as for physical cargo. Buddhism arrived here from India during the Kushan Empire 2,000 years ago. We will be visiting the two Buddhist monasteries of Fayez Tepe and Kara Tepe. Fayez Tepe is the one pictured here. And nearby, there are the ruins of a 12-meter high Zomala stupa, one of the oldest structures still standing in Central Asia. It's very rare for tour groups to go to Termiz, but as far as I'm concerned, this part of Uzbekistan is a must-see. Not only does it have some of the most important archaeological sites in the country, but visiting also gives you a strong sense of the far-reaching geographical and cultural ties which existed here millennia ago. Globalization is nothing new. Next slide, please. When we drive north from Termiz, you will see how these multicultural influences persist to the present day. The cultural space of Ibbotson has intangible cultural heritage status, meaning that this particular district is recognized by UNESCO as preserving particular cultural practices and expressions, which are essential components of humanity's cultural diversity and cultural expression. In ancient times, the Silk Roads linking Asia Minor and India made this an ethnic and cultural melting pot. But subsequent political changes isolated the people of Ibbotson, enabling them to keep traditions which elsewhere was lost. Their rituals show traces of several religions, including shamanistic beliefs, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Islam. Many of the rites which you see here, including to celebrate the spring festival of Navruz, and for births, circumcisions, weddings, and funerals, are unique in the modern world. The people of Ibbotson are the guardians of something very special indeed. We will have 2 nights here, time to meet and talk with local families, see their handicrafts at the Ibbotson Museum of National Applied Art, and taste their food, listen to their music, and also appreciate the beauty of the surrounding landscape. Next slide, please. Staying with local families in homestays, guest houses, and even yurts gives you a very different perspective of Uzbekistan than if you limit yourself to hotels and urban areas. I am a huge advocate of community-based tourism, as I know is Raoul, because it provides guests with an immersive cultural experience. And also, as importantly, it ensures that local people benefit economically and socially from tourism. Uzbekistan is rightly renowned for the warmth of its hospitality. And when we sit together, eat together, and talk together, exchanging jokes, opinions, and memories, we connect at a very deep level. Some of these exchanges become the basis for long-lasting relationships. I've made friendships which are still going strong years after we first met. I hope that your time in Ibbotson will make a similar impression on you as it does on me, and that you stay in a local guest house in Hayat village and in the yurt camp at Ibbotson later on in the trip, that you will start being able to compare and contrast different experiences of urban and rural life. After all, Uzbekistan is a country the size of Spain, and there are many regional differences. Next slide. I'm going to move on now to talk about what are arguably the two greatest cities on the Silk Roads, and certainly the two which are easiest to visit, given that those in Iran are currently out of bounds. These, of course, are the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. These twin cities, 2 hours apart by high-speed train, really embody the romance of the Silk Roads. And more often than not, they're the reasons that people want to visit Uzbekistan in the first place. Their magnificently tiled madrasas and mosques illustrate coffee table books, magazine covers, and brochures, and their dramatic architecture has the power to silence even the most well-traveled of visitors. Of the two cities, Samarkand is the oldest and largest, founded probably in the 8th century BC, though the surrounding area was inhabited by humans since at least the late Paleolithic era. The name Samarkand means city of stone in Sogdian, and the ancient Greeks adopted the same name, calling it Marakanda. The city was a major target on Alexander the Great's march east, and Alexander conquered it in 329 BC. When he finally took control of the city, he declared, "Everything I have heard about Marakanda is true, except that it is more beautiful than I ever imagined." Next slide, please. The city of Samarkand that you see today is not the same city that Alexander saw, though. It's not unusual for cities to go through phases of development, destruction, and reconstruction, and Samarkand is no different. The Greeks, Sasanians, Hephthalites, Samanids, Karakanids, and others all left their mark. Two mighty emperors would change the appearance of Samarkand beyond all recognition, though, and in a very short period. Genghis Khan attacked Samarkand in 1220, allegedly killing all of those who took refuge in the citadel and mosque. His Mongol troops pillaged the city and they laid it to waste. The ruins they left behind, which are the ones you can see in the picture here, are what we know as Afrasiab archaeological site. This was far too valuable a local area to leave as a wasteland, however, and so by the time that Marco Polo visited towards the end of that same century, Samarkand was already well on the way to recovery, albeit beyond the confines of the original sort of city that was there. I think they probably will have reused some of the stones and the bricks, but the new city was built in parallel with the old rather than over the top of it. Marco Polo described the city he saw as a very large and splendid city, and this is a view which was echoed by another famous traveller, Ibn Battuta, 40 or so years later. Next slide, please. It was in the 14th century, in this period of recovery, that the Samarkand we see today started taking shape. Quite rightly, historians talk of a Timurid renaissance. Amir Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, made Samarkand his capital in 1370. And over the next 4 decades, he built a spectacular city. The Timurid Empire stretched from Turkey to India, and Timur wanted Samarkand to be its jewel. He brought the greatest architects, engineers, and artisans here to make his dream a reality, and he paid for the work with the spoils of his many wars. The Bibi Khanum Mosque, which is in the centre of this photo, was completed in 1404, and it was intended to be Samarkand's congregational mosque. The construction for it was paid for with the wealth Timur seized sacking Delhi. He used 95 Indian elephants, another recent acquisition from that battle, to do the heavy lifting. And the artisans decorated the interior with gilded papier-mâché, a craft which he brought here from Kashmir. In size, Bibi Khanum dwarfed all other mosques of the time. It could accommodate almost 10,000 worshippers, and it remained the tallest building in Samarkand well into the 20th century. Next slide, please. A very short walk from the Bibi Khanum is the Registan, the architectural masterpiece which is to Uzbekistan as the Taj Mahal is to India or Angkor Wat is to Cambodia. In the Timurid period, this was already the most important part of the city, politically and economically. But in the intervening years, it has grown in size and splendor. Timur's grandson, the emperor and astronomer Ulugh built the madrasa on the left, and in doing so created one of the greatest universities in the Islamic world. The madrasa in the center and on the right, the Tilyakori and Sherdor madrasas, are later structures constructed in the 17th century on the orders of Yalangtush Bahadur, Samarkand's military governor. By the time that these two madrasas were built, the seat of power had shifted from Samarkand to Bukhara. Interestingly, Yalangtush Bahadur died before the Tilyakori madrasa was completed, and it wasn't until the Soviet period that the prayer hall's outer dome was finally finished. Next slide, please. Samarkand was no longer the capital because when the Timurid Empire disintegrated, multiple smaller successor states emerged in its place. These successor states included 3 khanates, essentially kingdoms, covering what is now Uzbekistan and parts of neighboring countries. In the west was the Khanate of Khiva, in the center, the Khanate and later Emirate of Bukhara, and in the east, the Khanate of Kokand. We'll be visiting Bukhara on the Silk Road Cities of Uzbekistan tour, and though Samarkand is the most famous of Uzbekistan's tourist destinations, Bukhara is my absolute favorite. Nowhere else combines historic monuments and vibrant residential neighborhoods so well. And with around 140 cultural heritage properties in the old city alone, there is always something more to see. Next slide, please. There are certain things in Bukhara's UNESCO World Heritage Site which are must-sees: the Ark Fortress, the Poikalon complex, and the Samanid Mausoleum amongst them. We will visit these with a local guide. But Bukhara is a city which has to be experienced as well as seen. I want you to go for a bath or a massage in the medieval Hammam Bozori Court. I want you to haggle in the trading domes for textiles and ceramics, and to sit drinking tea in Liabi House, watching the world go by. This isn't a city to rush through. It deserves your time and it deserves quiet contemplation. Bukhara is often called Holy Bukhara or Noble Bukhara because of the numbers of madrasas and shrines which are here, but you don't have to be religious or even spiritual to enjoy the atmosphere of the place. Next slide, please. The primary focus of my talk tonight has been on Uzbekistan's historic sites, but many of them are entwined with Uzbekistan's Soviet legacy. If it weren't for Soviet archaeologists, historians, and conservation teams, we wouldn't still have or be able to understand many of the monuments that we enjoy today. The opposite, sadly, is also true. The Ark in Bukhara is a fraction of its former size, as it was bombed by the Russians in 1920, and many of the other monuments around that square were completely destroyed. Uzbekistan has always been shaped by invaders, though, with cycles of construction, destruction, and rebirth. The city of Tashkent, the capital of modern Uzbekistan, was almost completely leveled by an earthquake in 1966, but it was rebuilt as a planned Soviet city, with workers coming from all across the USSR to provide their labor. Like the Silk Road cities of old, Soviet migrants made their work. You can walk down Taras Shevchenko Street and see a monument dedicated to this great Ukrainian poet. The Alisher Nevoy Opera and Ballet Theatre was designed by Alexei Shushev, the Russian architect most famous for creating Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square. And in the antiques halls of the Yangibad Bazaar, you'll find crystal from Czechoslovakia, porcelain from Leningrad, and carpets from the Caucasus. The same eclectic influences are visible, or perhaps I should say edible, in the food halls of markets and in restaurants. Morkovka, a Korean carrot salad, is a perennial favorite, as is the mayonnaise-drenched Olivier, a Russian favorite. Riding the Tashkent metro, where every station was designed and decorated by a different architect or artist, will be a highlight of your trip, and is a very easy and convenient way to get around the center of Tashkent. As you might have guessed, I can talk about Uzbekistan for hours and hours and hours, but I'm aware that dinner and a bed will await you at some point this evening. I know Raoul is going to talk a little bit more about the practical elements of the tour, and then we will move on to the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you. Okay, yes, so let me just share another screen. Give me 2 seconds, please. Go. A second, here we go. Okay, so thank you, Sophie. That was really, really insightful. And of course, yeah, as Sophie mentioned, we're running this trip with her at the end of April. We're going to be closing that trip in about a week's time. So anyone who might be interested in that, please do go to our website. It's a 14-day trip. It's currently reduced, and the price, 425, is for single supplements. We do run another Uzbekistan trip. It's slightly shorter, the Uzbekistan Odyssey trip. We have multiple departures in the year. It's 11 days, and that's just under £2,000. And again, the single supplement on that is $295. I mean, both trips obviously will, have to cover the Silk Road heritage in Uzbekistan because there is so much of it. But again, both do get quite off the beaten track as well. And I know something that has been very popular is for those who have a bit of extra time, you can extend into some of the other neighboring stands or Central Asian countries, and that can be organized. And just some practicalities about traveling to Uzbekistan. So just 5 hours ahead of GMT. Typically the best times to travel are, as you see there, April, May, September and October. You can probably go very early in November, but then once you're getting kind of a little bit later, it does start getting quite cold, as the winter kind of progresses. There are very convenient flights from London Heathrow in the UK. There are currently 2 flights a week. And Sophie just updated me a few days back saying there's going to be a 3rd flight now from London on a Sunday from the 26th of March. And for those of you who might be joining from the US, there are direct flights as well from New York twice a week. Currently, British passport holders can enter without a visa for 30 days. US passport holders can get a new visa quite straightforward, I believe, online for $20. And as is happening essentially through kind of most of the world now, COVID restrictions in terms of entry have been relaxed. So irrespective of your vaccination status, you are able to enter Uzbekistan. And just some simple kind of money notes is that the official currency is Uzbek Sum. ATMs are available in major cities. But in terms of foreign currency, it's usually the US dollar that is preferred. Sophie, is there anything else you want to add in terms of practicalities, in terms of traveling to Uzbekistan at all? Oh, let's hear you. Sorry, give me a second, sorry. Let's see where you are. Oh, muted, it seems. Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much.
Sorry about that, Sophia.
I think that covers the key points. The other things to emphasize are that Uzbekistan is a very, very safe country to travel in, which is, I know a lot of people sometimes are concerned, countries ending in stan, Muslim countries, country close to Afghanistan, is it too close to Russia, all of these sorts of questions, but I would say very, very safe on the ground. Another question which often comes up is about the type of transport. So for a tour, if you're coming with me or you're going on one of Raul's other tours within Uzbekistan, there are generally three methods of transport. One is domestic flights with Uzbekistan Airways, which has very good quality, relatively new aircraft. The second is the high-speed train, which is a bullet train. People are often quite surprised that Uzbekistan has got a faster, flashier train system than we have, but that links from Tashkent to Samarkand and Bukhara. And then the third method of transport that we'll be using is air-conditioned vehicles for the road journeys where there is not a convenient train route to take.
And Sophie, someone's just asked, I mean, again, it would depend on the itinerary, but like how many hours per day are spent traveling? I mean, I guess if you're visiting the major cities and you're driving between them, I mean, what would you say would be the longest drive?
So it very much depends on where you're going. So for example, the train journey from Tashkent to Samarkand takes just over 2 hours, and the same to go from Samarkand to Bukhara. The longest journey anybody is likely to take, and it's a reason we're not including it on the tour that I'm leading in April, is if you want to go from Bukhara to Khiva in the west, then you are looking at 7 to 8 hours drive in one direction to get there. There is a highway under construction, but unfortunately it's not complete yet, and therefore there are stretches where the journey is very slow. So if you do want to go to Khiva as well, my general recommendation is that you drive in one direction, and then you take a domestic flight from Urgench, which is the airport about 20 minutes away from Khiva, back to Tashkent or back to Samarkand at the end of your trip.
Great. And in terms of, I mean, obviously I mentioned, you know, the best time to travel. Can one also travel off season? I mean, of course you can, but I mean, is it prohibitive to go, you know, in peak summer? I mean, I would have thought you had the sites to yourself, but I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It depends very much what your interest is. I wouldn't recommend sightseeing in the height of summer because the temperatures can be in the upper 40s Celsius. And it's very, very dry, very hot, and there is the risk of dehydration and heat stroke. However, if you wanted to do a small amount of sightseeing and then go up in the mountains to do hiking, then that would be a very good option. The opposite, if you wanted to travel in the winter, I wouldn't suggest then hiking. The mountains will be covered in snow, but there is some very good winter sports. So the Amisoy resort, which has been developed near to Tashkent, opened about 3 years ago. And that's got fantastic skiing and snowboarding. So you could actually have a trip which combined a few days of winter sports with some cultural sightseeing in Samarkand and in Tashkent as well, a real mix and match.
Mm-hmm. And the Aral Sea area, I mean, would that typically be included, would you say, on the tours? Or?
So I'm very interested in the Aral Sea region. And in fact, I have, with my co-writer Steph, done a new book to Karakalpakstan, the first guidebook to that area, which is going to be published by Brat in June this year. It's not an area which is included in the classic Uzbekistan tours, again, because it's quite some distance to get to. However, if you are interested in ecotourism, in particular in geology, in birding, and of course seeing the Aral Sea itself, highly recommend Karakalpakstan. And you can combine that quite easily with Khiva. So starting, for example, in Khiva, seeing the UNESCO World Heritage old city there, then working up through the southern part of Karakalpakstan, where there are more than 50 desert fortresses, going to Nukus, the capital of Karakalpakstan, for the Savitsky Museum, which has a very famous Russian avant-garde art collection, and then carrying on up to the Aral Sea.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you've been telling me about this region for some time, so I would, yeah, I'm very hopeful that in the near future we'll be able to offer some kind of extension to that area as well. And in terms of, I mean, I did allude to the fact that it's very easy to add on extensions in some of the neighboring countries. I mean, is there anything, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on that as well? It's convenient, of course, there are flights, but I mean, land crossings, for example, between Uzbekistan and other countries.
The land crossings are getting easier and easier. And from the sort of central and eastern parts of Uzbekistan, the easiest places to cross into are to Kyrgyzstan and to Tajikistan. Kyrgyzstan is visa-free for British nationals. Tajikistan, you can get an e-visa. So again, that's quite straightforward. I do understand that Turkmenistan, which has been shut due to COVID for longer than any other country I've heard of, is now planning on reopening its borders and will be issuing tourist visas again from later this month. So if you did want to go to Turkmenistan to see, for example, the Darvaz gas crater or the archaeological sites at Merv and Konya-Genç, that will be possible again later this year. I'm not sure exactly what date they will reopen, but it's certainly imminent.
Sure. And I see one comment about flight costs. I mean, yeah, I think one thing that we've just noticed since COVID or since after lockdown is unfortunately flight prices have gone up literally everywhere. So yeah, I mean, currently flight prices are approximately about £750, round trip from the UK, whether you fly next month or October. We don't know. I guess the new dates are released and fares are released from November onwards. I'm assuming, Sophie, it'll be there or thereabouts, I guess, 750.
I think so. There does seem to be more airlines entering the market. We've seen particularly a number of the budget airlines from the Middle East have started to fly into Uzbekistan in the last few months. So one option that you could do is look out, for example, for cheap flights to Dubai and then pick up Fly Dubai flight from Dubai to Uzbekistan, or Wizz Air is also flying from Abu Dhabi now to Samarkand and to Tashkent. So again, if you can get to Abu Dhabi, that might be a good option. There are also flights with Turkish Airlines via Istanbul.
Great. And in terms of accommodation, obviously you touched on, some of the community, homestays, guest houses. In terms of the main cities, I mean, what would your comments be in terms of like standard of accommodation?
There's a lot of variety now, which there wasn't even 5 years ago. So if you want to stay in 5-star international hotels, you have good options in Tashkent, some reasonable options, or one or two options elsewhere in places like Samarkand and in Khiva. Generally, however, I personally would recommend the smaller hotels, the boutique hotels. Bukhara in particular has got some fantastic historic properties, merchants' houses, madrasas, and so on and so forth, which have been converted into boutique hotels, and Khiva, the same is the case there. I also highly recommend the homestays and the guest houses, because that's where you'll have a local, authentic experience with a family. So it's a good option to be able to mix and match those, perhaps to stay in a bigger, higher end hotel when you first arrive in Tashkent, particularly if you had a night flight and want to crash straight out. But then as you're traveling around Uzbekistan, to be able to put in some community-based options as well.
And food-wise, yes, one sees pictures, these fantastic markets. I mean, how is the food in Uzbekistan? And again, if one's vegetarian, etc. How is it for vegetarians, for example?
So the food is very, very varied, partly because of the Silk Road heritage. So there'll be dishes that you recognize that, oh yes, I've had something like that in India, I've had something like that in Iran, that's like a Turkish so-and-so. And a huge amount of fresh produce, particularly in late spring and early summer through to the autumn. So the markets are groaning under the weight of fresh fruit and vegetables and breads. In terms of catering for vegetarians and vegans, this isn't something which is a sort of a traditional part of Uzbekistan's cuisine. It has always been quite a meat and dairy heavy cuisine, despite the fact they have such good fresh produce. But restaurants now, and particularly those who have foreign guests, are much more familiar with dietary requirements. And as long as you let your guide know in advance of what your dietary needs are, they will ensure that you're catered for.
Perfect. All right, I think those are all the questions that I received. Okay, yeah, I mean, in terms of dress and attire, is it a conservative country? Can one dress quite liberally, or yeah, what's your advice on that?
It is socially conservative, but it's not restrictive. So I certainly I don't have any issue wearing a t-shirt. I never cover my head, wear jeans. So dress tends to be quite Western. You do occasionally see people in shorts, but they I would say on the whole be foreigners. So it would be if you're trying to blend in, shorts is not the way forward. However, if you're just hot, I would say probably leave your hot pants at home. But yes, some sort of knee-length baggy shorts would be absolutely fine. The one thing I would say with dress is if you're traveling in summer, to make sure that what you've got is very light and very loose, because the likelihood of getting sunburnt, and I'm pretty pasty, is high. And so I do try to cover up, not because of sort of social cultural reasons, but actually because of the heat and the risk of sunburn.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, Sophie. I don't see any more questions, but again, if there are any more questions that come to mind after this, then please obviously just do drop me an email, and either myself or Sophie will certainly get back to you. And just to highlight, we are going to touch on another part of the Silk Road, the Himalayan Silk Road, kind of almost like kind of a forgotten part of the Silk Road. And as Sophie mentioned early on in her talk, that there were many Silk Roads, and this was an area that I explored last summer, and on the back of that, and again, Sophie is another expert in that region. She's written a guidebook to Kashmir and Ladakh, and we will be doing a talk on this particular region. And the date is yet to be confirmed, but probably in 2 to 3 weeks, perhaps. But again, I'll be sending out a newsletter to inform you about that. But once again, Sophie, thank you again for your insightful talk tonight, and for all of you joining us from whether in the UK, I saw some join from the US, and thank you for giving up your time. And there'll be more information, of course, on our website. And if there's anything, any questions you have, do drop us a line. And just a reminder again, if you are interested in that Silk Road Secrets of Uzbekistan tour that Sophie will be leading, that trip will be closing about a week's time. So again, just drop me a line if you're interested in that. Okay, great. Well, have a great evening, or a great rest of the day, depending on where you are, and we'll catch you for the next talk. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Anne.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.